you believe in cursed places? I didn't, until I found myself locked in Ward 404. It wasn't just a hospital ward, it was a tomb for forgotten souls. I was the only living thing inside, but I wasn't alone. And to escape, I had to make an impossible choice. My name is David, and this is my story. But be warned, this story isn't for the faint of heart. It was 7:30 n Tuesday, and it was just another night at St. Lucie Hospital. Renovations were underway in the East Wing, and the air was filled with the sounds of drills, hammers, and the occasional curse from frustrated contractors. My shift was ending, and I was ready to head home. The East Wing was cordoned off, but as I passed the hallway, something caught my eye, a faint light coming from Ward 404. That was strange because 404 wasn't supposed to be in use. In fact, no one ever went near it. You see, 404 wasn't just another ward. It was a ghost story, a piece of hospital folklore. No one really knew why, but staff whispered about strange occurrences. Lights flickering, faint voices, and an overwhelming feeling of dread. It was the ward everyone avoided. I should have kept walking. I should have ignored that light. But something pulled me toward it, a mix of curiosity and something else. When I reached the door, it was slightly ajar. I hesitated, but then I heard it, a faint noise like a whisper. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening clang. I spun around and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "Great," I muttered. Locked in. The ward was dimly lit by a single, flickering fluorescent bulb. The air was thick, heavy, almost oppressive. It smelled of mildew and something metallic, like old blood. At first glance, it looked like any other hospital ward, except older. Dust coated the furniture, and the walls were yellowed with age. But as I looked closer, I noticed things that didn't make sense. The equipment was outdated, like it belonged in the 1960s. A heart monitor sat in the corner. Its screen cracked, but it was still beeping faintly, though no one was connected to it. And then I heard it. "Help us." The voice was faint, barely audible. I froze. Is someone there?" I called out. The ward responded. The fluorescent light buzzed loudly, and the heart monitor began to glitch, its beeping turning into a low, distorted hum. Shadows flickered along the walls, though there was no movement to cast them. "Let us go." The voice came again, louder this time. I backed into a corner, clutching my phone. The flashlight barely cut through the darkness, but it revealed something horrifying. The walls were covered in faded writing, names, dates, messages like they lied to us and trapped forever. And then the whispers became screams. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, faint, translucent shapes that flickered like static on an old TV. The shadows closed in, and suddenly, I wasn't in the ward anymore. I was somewhere else entirely, an endless, dark corridor lined with hospital beds. Each bed held a patient, their faces covered with oxygen masks, their bodies hooked up to machines. "These were the experiments," the voice said. "They wanted to extend life, but they only created torment." The patients began to convulse, their monitors blaring with distorted alarms. "They sealed the ward to hide their failure," the voice continued. "But they didn't destroy it. They left us here, to suffer, to be forgotten." I was back in the ward now, surrounded by the spirits. "You have a choice," the voice said. "Set us free, or leave, and let the torment continue." "What do you mean, set you free?" I asked. "To break the cycle, someone must stay. Someone must become the warden of this place. If you take our place, we can finally rest." My blood ran cold. "And if I don't?" The shadows loomed closer. "Then you leave, and the suffering goes on. But know this, once you've entered, the ward will always call you back." I stood there, heart pounding. as the ward seemed to press in around me. Could I really stay here forever? Could I give up my life to free these souls? But if I left, I'd be condemning them to endless torment, and I'd have to live with that. I thought about my family, my friends, my life outside these walls. But then I looked at them. The spirits, their faces twisted with pain, their voices filled with desperation. I closed my eyes and made my choice. The door to Ward 44 opened the next morning. The renovation crew found the ward empty, except for a single note scrawled on the wall. The warden has taken their place. But here's the thing, what really happened. I'm still telling this story. So did I really stay? Or did I leave? And is Ward 404 still out there, waiting for its next victim? The next time you see a door marked 404, remember this. Some doors should never be opened.
Have you ever felt like a place was wrong? Not just creepy, but fundamentally off. That's how I felt when I stepped into Ward 13 for my night shift. My name is Diana. I am a nurse and I have a confession to make. I've worked in hospitals for years, and I've seen my fair share of unsettling things. But this was different. Ward 13 wasn't even supposed to be in use. Had been shut down years ago. But the hospital was overcrowded, and management decided to reopen it temporarily. I didn't ask questions. I just grabbed my clipboard, took a deep breath, and walked in. The place reeked of neglect. The walls were cracked, the paint peeling in long, jagged strips. The lights buzzed and flickered like they couldn't quite decide whether to stay on or off. And it was cold. Not the kind of cold you fix with a jacket. This was bone-deep, unnatural. First, it was quiet. Too quiet. Even in the dead of night, hospitals aren't supposed to be this silent. There's always something. Machines beeping, footsteps echoing, the low hum of activity. But here, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint hum of the flickering lights. Then I heard it, whispers. Froze. They were soft at first, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the emptiness of the ward. No answer. I told myself it was my imagination. Long shifts can mess with your head, right? So I shook it off and got to work. But as the night went on, the whispers got louder. And they weren't random. They sounded like my name. The lights started flickering more, casting these weird, elongated shadows that seemed to move on their own. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my hands were trembling. And then I saw him. One of the beds, which I knew was empty, now had a patient lying in it. He was an older man, pale, with sunken eyes. He stared at the ceiling, completely still. I checked my chart. There was no record of anyone assigned to that bed. My heart pounded as I approached him. "Sir, are you okay?" He didn't respond. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and just like that, he was gone. The bed was empty again, like he'd never been there. I ran to the nurse's station, desperate for answers. I pulled up the hospital's records and searched the name that had been on the patient's bracelet. My stomach dropped. That man had died 5 years ago. That's when I realized. The whispers weren't just in my head. I tried to stay calm, but everything was unraveling. I started seeing figures out of the corner of my eye. Shadowy shapes that would vanish as soon as I turned to look. The air grew colder. And the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Desperate for some kind of explanation, I dug through the ward's old files. What I found still haunts me. There was a pattern. Every few years, a nurse would be assigned to Ward 13. And every time, their employment records would abruptly end with no explanation. No resignations, no transfers, just gone. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A roster from decades ago. The name at the top. It was crossed out in red ink. Below it, my name had been written. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. It was like the ward had claimed me, just like it had claimed the others. That's when I found the message, scrawled on a board in what looked like ash or dried blood, hidden behind a filing cabinet. The only way out is to take another's place. This could be written by another victim who didn't make it out. My mind raced. What did it mean? Who could I scrambled through the employment list of nurses. Laura was my best friend. She was scheduled to take the next shift. If I left, the ward would take her instead. I paced the empty halls, my heart pounding. The shadows seemed to close in around me, and the whispers rose to a deafening chorus. I had to make a choice. If I stayed, I'd become part of the ward's cursed history, trapped forever. But if I left, Laura would take my place. All I had to do was cancel out my name and it will move to her. When my shift ended, I stood at the door, shaking. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was even worse. I took one last look at the ward, its cold, empty halls, and walked away. The next day, Laura didn't show up for work. I checked the roster again. Her name was crossed out, replaced by someone else's. The cycle continues. I don't know how much longer I can live with what I did. The ward is still there, waiting. And every night I hear the whispers, calling me back. Laura has a daughter. Am I as evil as the ward? Did I do something wrong? Was I chosen at random? Or was it my fate to be there?
They say hospitals are places of healing, but I've learned they can also be places of darkness. It started with whispers, strange marks on my skin, and patients mysteriously losing blood. But the truth was far worse. Let me tell you about the time I almost lost myself. Or maybe I already did. I've been a nurse in the oncology ward for 5 years. It's tough work, caring for patients in some of their darkest hours, but it's meaningful. Or at least, that's what I used to tell myself. It started on an ordinary Tuesday night. The ward was quiet, as it usually is after midnight. I was making my rounds, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, and reassuring anyone struggling to sleep. But that night, something felt quite off. Mrs. Hargrove, one of my regulars, looked pale. Not just pale from her illness, this was different. Her lips were dry, her skin nearly translucent. "Are you feeling okay, Mrs. Hargrove?" I asked, trying to sound calm. She nodded weakly, but didn't say a word. I checked her chart. Everything seemed normal. No new medications, no changes in treatment. But when I looked at her bag, I froze. The fluid was tinged pink. Blood. The next morning, I reported it. The doctor shrugged it off as a possible mix-up with the equipment. But I knew better. It wasn't a one-time thing. Over the next week, more patients showed the same signs: fatigue, unexplained bruising, and blood levels dropping without reason. Then I noticed something terrifying: bruises on my own arms, as if needles had pierced my veins. I joked with a coworker about being a sleepy vampire victim, but inside, I was spiraling. I did the only rational thing I could think of. I went to see the IT guy, and that's when I saw the security footage. It was late at night. A patient had lost a significant amount of blood again, and I demanded to see the tapes. The guard hesitated, but eventually relented. What I saw made my stomach drop. There I was, walking into Mrs. Hargrove's room at 2:45 a.m. I was calm, deliberate, almost robotic. I stood by her bed for a moment, leaned over her foreline, and then left. But here's the thing. I had no memory of doing it. I started keeping a journal, writing down every detail of my shifts. I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't losing my mind. But the bruises kept appearing, and the gaps in my memory grew longer. One night, I woke up in my car outside the hospital. My scrubs were damp, and there were faint streaks of blood on my sleeves. Something's wrong with me, I whispered to my reflection in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. Something moved behind me in the mirror. A shadow, not mine, slipping into the back seat. I began researching. Late nights in the hospital library, scrolling through old records. And I found something chilling. Decades ago, this hospital had rumors of a blood taker, an unseen force that preyed on patients in the oncology ward. It wasn't human, but it needed a human host to survive. It was a parasite, latching onto someone weak, using them as a vessel to feed. And now it was using me. The next night I set up a trap. I stayed late, pretending to work, but I had rigged a small camera in my pocket. Around 3 a.m., I felt it, the cold, crawling sensation in the back of my mind. My vision blurred, and my body felt distant, like I was watching myself from outside. The footage later confirmed it. There I was, standing over a patient, eyes unfocused, my hands moving with eerie precision. But in the corner of the frame, there it was, a shadowy figure, hunched and formless, clinging to my back. I had to stop it. I couldn't keep being its puppet. But every attempt I made, praying, meditating, even calling a priest, failed. It was too deeply connected to me. Then I realized something horrifying. Severing our connection might free me, but it wouldn't destroy the creature. It would simply find another host, another nurse, another innocent life. One night, I stood in the hospital parking lot, my car keys in hand. I could leave, walk away, sever my connection to the hospital entirely. But the thought haunted me. What if it found someone else? Someone weaker? I stayed. Not because I was brave, but because I was afraid of what it might do without me. All these happened some months ago. I still work here, and the patient's mysterious blood loss has stopped. I haven't seen the shadow in weeks, but some nights when I close my eyes I feel it. That cold, crawling sensation. Is it gone? Or is it just waiting for me to let my guard down? So tell me, if you knew you were carrying a monster, what would you do? Would you walk away? Or would you stay and fight, knowing it might never truly be over?
You ever feel like you're being watched? Not by someone you can see, but by something. Like there's a presence in the room that knows everything about you. Your secrets, your regrets, your worst mistakes. I didn't believe in that kind of thing until I took the shift at the Echo Ward. It started innocently enough. I'd been a nurse for years, moving from one hospital to the next, never staying long enough to put down roots. St. Adrian's Hospital seemed like just another gig. That was until they assigned me to the Echo Ward, a section of the hospital tucked away on the farthest wing. When I asked why it was called the Echo Ward, the supervisor gave me a strange look and said, "You'll find out soon enough." The wing was eerily quiet when I first walked in, even by hospital standards. The lights flickered faintly, and the air was heavy, like it hadn't been stirred in years. There were only a handful of patients, each lying still in their beds. They weren't hooked up to monitors or IVs. In fact, there was no record of them at all. No names, no medical histories, nothing. I was assigned to room 3 first. A woman in her 40s, sitting perfectly upright in her bed, staring at the wall. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. As I stepped closer, I realized she was mouthing something over and over again.
"Why didn't you help me?"
Her voice came out of nowhere, soft and accusing. "Why didn't you help me?" I froze. The words weren't just random, they struck something deep inside me. Years ago, during my first job as a nurse, I'd hesitated in an emergency. A young woman had died on my watch because I second-guessed myself. No one ever blamed me, but I carried the guilt. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I'd read her lips wrong. Maybe it was just coincidence. But as I turned to leave, she whispered again, "You remember?" The next night, I was assigned to room 7. Inside was an older man, his face gaunt, his eyes glassy. He looked at me and smiled faintly. "How's your father, Daniel?" he asked. I froze. "How do you know my name?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he shifted his gaze toward the ceiling. "You never forgave yourself, did you? Leaving him alone like that?" My chest tightened. My father and I had a strained relationship. He died alone in a nursing home, and I never made it in time to say goodbye. The words I'd always avoided, the guilt I'd buried, came flooding back. The man in room 7 began to hum a lullaby my dad used to sing when I was a kid. It sent chills through me. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I'm your echo," he said simply. Over the next few nights, every patient in the Echo Ward began to reflect pieces of my past. The teenager in room 5 replayed the moment I froze during my first major trauma case. A woman in room 2 mirrored the time I betrayed a close friend, exposing her private struggles to our co-workers. But it wasn't just their words. It was the way they looked at me, like they knew everything. And worse, it felt like the ward itself was changing. The walls seemed closer, the air colder. The faint hum of fluorescent lights was replaced by whispers. At first, I thought I was going crazy. I tried to avoid the patients, but their voices followed me, growing louder every time I ignored them. "Face it, Daniel," they'd say. "You can't run forever." Desperate for answers, I decided to dig through the hospital archives, but there was nothing. No records of the Echo Ward, no files on the patients, nothing to suggest it even existed. It was like the entire wing was a ghost. Frustrated, I confronted my supervisor. "Why are there no records of the Echo Ward? Who are these patients?" Her expression changed, cold, detached. "It's not about the patients, Daniel. It's about you." Before I could press further, she handed me a clipboard. It wasn't my usual shift schedule. Instead, it listed every patient's name and a single word beside each one: regret. "Your shift ends when you decide," she said, then walked away. That night, I stayed late, sitting in the break room, trying to make sense of everything. I flipped through the clipboard again and again, the weight of it sinking deeper. These weren't patients. They were pieces of me. Then it hit me like a freight train. I wasn't alive. The memories flooded back all at once. The car accident on my way to work. The sound of shattering glass. The blinding pain. I had never believed in purgatory, but the Echo Ward definitely wasn't a hospital wing. When I returned to the ward, the patients were waiting for me. All of them, standing at the foot of their beds, their faces filled with a strange mix of sadness and anticipation. "You know why you're here," said the woman from room 3. I nodded. "To make amends." They stepped forward one by one, forcing me to confront every moment of my life I'd tried to bury. The guilt, the shame, the pain, it all came rushing back. It was unbearable, like reliving each regret in excruciating detail. Then, the older man from room 7 stepped forward. "You have a choice, Daniel. Face your judgment, or stay here forever." I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the ward seemed to close in around me, the patients' voices growing louder, overlapping in a deafening cacophony. And then silence. I opened my eyes to find myself alone. The ward was empty, the patients gone. But their words lingered, etched into me like scars. "Face your truth." I don't know if I made the right choice that night, but sometimes when the world is quiet, I hear their voices, echoes of a life I can't take back. If you ever find yourself in a place like the Echo Ward, remember this. It's not the patients you should fear. It's yourself.
They say hospitals are places of healing, but some places are different. I used to think I was unshakable. I'd seen the worst: blood, death, despair. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I encountered in the isolation ward. Because when the walls start whispering your name, there's no running from it. I started my week at the hospital with a new assignment: the isolation ward. I remember the charge nurse briefing me. "Kate, it's a tough post. The patients there are unpredictable. But we're short-staffed, and you're our best bet." Unpredictable. That was a nice way of saying no one wanted the job. The ward was on the hospital's oldest floor, far from the bustling ER and the warmth of the general wards. Isolation 3A had been repurposed since during and after the outbreak of the coronavirus. "Keep your PPE on at all times," they told me. "And don't listen to anything the patients say. They're not in their right minds." I stepped into the ward that night, and it was silent. Too silent. The air felt heavier here, the fluorescent lights casting an unnatural glow. The walls were a pale green, but they seemed to ripple slightly, like the surface of water. I shook it off, just my imagination, I thought. The patients were in separate rooms, visible through thick glass windows. Some lay motionless, others stared blankly at the ceiling. A few mumbled to themselves, their words muffled by the walls. Around midnight, I checked on Mr. Harlan, a man in his 60s. He was sweating profusely, muttering something under his breath. When I leaned closer to check his for, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "Do you hear it?" he whispered, his voice raspy. "They're in the walls, breathing, calling." I pulled away, gently prying his hand off me. "It's just the fever talking," I assured him. But deep down I felt a chill I couldn't explain. By my second night, things got stranger. I was writing up notes at the nurse's station when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound. At first, I thought it was the ventilation system, but it wasn't. It was coming from the walls. Sounded like breathing. Slow, deliberate inhales and exhales. I walked down the corridor, following the sound. As I passed each room, the breathing grew louder, more synchronized. I stopped outside a patient's door, my pulse quickening. And then I heard it, a whisper. My name. Kate. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The whisper came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. "Kate, help us." The next day, I confronted Dr. Reed, the attending physician overseeing the ward. "Dr. Reed, the patients keep talking about voices in the walls. And last night Heard something. What's going on in there? He hesitated, then sighed. Kate, you're not crazy. The virus, it's not just physical. It's evolving. It affects the brain, but not like any disease we've seen. Spreads through sound, through voices. That's why the ward is isolated. Why we've sealed it off. What do you mean, spreads through sound? The infected, they become part of the environment. The walls, the air, everything. It's like the virus lives through them, using them to communicate, to spread. That night I couldn't sleep. The walls didn't just breathe anymore, they pulsed. I stood in the hallway, staring at them. The green paint seemed to shift, almost like a heartbeat beneath the surface. I placed my hand against the wall, and I swear it felt warm, alive. And then the whispers came again. Kate, join us. Suddenly, I was flooded with visions. Faces of the patients I'd cared for, their mouths open in silent screams, their bodies pressed against the walls, as if they were trapped inside. I stumbled back, gasping for air. I knew I had to leave, but something kept me there. I felt drawn to the whispers like they were pulling me in. Dr. Reed's words echoed in my mind. It spreads through sound. I ripped the stethoscope from around my neck and threw it to the floor. Then I grabbed the emergency earplugs from my pocket and shoved them in. The whispers dulled, but I could still feel them in my chest like a vibration. I ran to the exit, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Stay with us, Kate. And then I saw it. My reflection in the glass door. My face was pale, veins dark and visible beneath my skin. The virus had already begun to take hold. I staggered back, clutching the wall for support. My hands pressed against the surface, and I felt it, movement, like hands reaching out to pull me in. The whispers became screams. The walls seemed to close in, the breathing turning into a deafening roar. And then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was standing in the hallway, alone. The walls were still, the air calm. I left that night and never went back. But sometimes late at night I still hear it. A faint whisper in the silence. Kate.
Have you ever had the feeling that you are not alone, even when you were completely isolated? I didn't believe in the supernatural until that night. The night I met her, the crying patient. My name is Deborah, or Nurse D as they call me. No one believed me, they all think I am crazy, but I want to tell my story. What really happened that night? I was just another nurse on the night shift, working in the quiet coma ward of St. Jude's Hospital, the kind of place where time felt frozen, with a soft hum of machines and the occasional shuffle of footsteps echoing down the hall. My co-workers joked that the coma ward was haunted, but I didn't pay much attention. But on that day, the 22nd of January, it all changed when she was brought in. Her name was Lily, a frail, pale teenager with long black hair and hollow cheeks. She'd survived a brutal massacre at a remote cabin, the sole survivor. Everyone else, her friends and family, had been slaughtered. They found her unconscious, covered in blood, and brought her to us. She was yet to gain consciousness. The first strange thing happened the night I was assigned to her. Started with crying. Not the soft whimper of someone in pain, but deep, guttural sobs that sent chills down my spine. The thing is, it wasn't coming from any of the patients. It was coming from Lily. I rushed to her bedside, my heart pounding. Her eyes were still closed, her body unmoving, but tears streaked her cheeks. They weren't ordinary tears. They were red, blood red. I cleaned her face, telling myself it was just a medical anomaly. But then I noticed something else. The room felt colder. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. And just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint whisper. "Help us." By the second night, things got worse. I found bloody handprints on the walls around Lily's bed. They weren't there before, and there was no one else in the ward who could have made them. There were other unconscious patients in the adjoining sections of the ward, separated only by thick curtains. The whispers grew louder each day, more distinct. Voices overlapping, pleading, accusing. She did this. One after the other, the patients in adjoining rooms all started exhibiting this restlessness. At first, I thought I was losing my mind, so I scrubbed the walls clean. I'm to be on night shift for 2 weeks in this particular ward, but apparently, no one on day shift complained, so I will sound stupid if I mention this. The other nurses didn't see or hear anything. It was just me. Or so I thought. By the third night, I started hearing footsteps in the hall, but every time I checked, it was empty. My shifts became a routine of cleaning, listening, and wondering if I'd finally lost my grip on reality. Then, during one of those lonely hours, I heard something new. Laughter. Low and guttural, coming from Lily's room. Everything has changed since she came, and the rest of the half-dead patients didn't seem to want her here. Judging with the midnight rumblings and increased reflex activities. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I started digging into Lily's past. What I found made my blood run cold. The massacre wasn't random. The victims had been tied up, their throats slit with precision. It wasn't the work of an outsider. It had to be someone they trusted. And then there was Lily's medical report. No signs of defensive wounds. No injuries consistent with an attack. How could she have been the sole survivor without a scratch? Desperate for answers, I found myself sitting in the hospital library during the day, scrolling through news articles about the massacre. Details were sparse, but one thing stood out. The police found strange symbols drawn in blood on the walls of the cabin. They'd written it off as the killer's signature, but the more I read, the more I felt those symbols were familiar. I'd seen something similar on the walls near Lily's bed. The more I read, the more convinced I became that there was something sinister about Lily. Her past was a gaping void of information. No childhood photos, no records of her attending school. It was as if she'd only existed in the weeks leading up to the massacre. On the fourth night, I decided to stay in the ward after my shift ended. I brought a flashlight and a journal to document everything. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. My breath fogged in the air. Then came the sound of scratching. It started faintly, like nails against wood, and grew louder. It was coming from the ceiling. I flashed the light, and I felt like I saw a shadow move across the ceiling, slow and deliberate, before disappearing into the corner of Lily's room. Froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but something rooted me to the spot. That's when I heard her voice. Soft, almost melodic.
You can't stop it.
The final piece clicked into place on the fifth night. I sat by Lily's bed, determined to stay awake and catch whatever was happening. Around 3 a.m., the whispers of the patients turned into cries, then screams. And Lily, still unconscious, started to smile. Suddenly, the whispers became words I could understand. Finish it. The air grew heavier, their faces twisted in agony. I pulled the dividing curtain to the end, to look at the elderly woman at the end of the ward. She was the one that spoke. She has been here for days and never opened her eyes. Finish what? I whispered back, moving close to her, my voice trembling. She killed us, she whispered. Make it right. My mind raced. The pieces were all there, but it felt impossible. Lily wasn't the victim. She was the killer. The symbols, the blood, the precision of the murders. It was her. The spirits weren't haunting her. They were seeking justice through me. My hands trembled as I looked down at Lily. Her smile had grown wider, more sinister. Her fingers twitched, as if she knew what I just realized. Then her eyes snapped open. Lily sat up, her movements unnatural, her head tilting at an impossible angle as she whispered to me, "You're too late." I stumbled back, the weight of unseen hands pressing me toward her. Whatever else that was in the room weren't just asking for justice. They were demanding it. My trembling hands found the syringe in my pocket, a sedative I'd prepared just in case. But as I stepped closer to her, Lily's laughter echoed, growing louder, drowning out the cries. Lily lunged at me, her strength far beyond what her frail body should have had. I barely managed to jab the needle into her arm. She collapsed back onto the bed, her body convulsing before falling still. The whispers quieted, but the shadows lingered. The room fell silent, but the air was heavy with tension. I stared at her lifeless form, half expecting her to lunge at me again. Then the shadows began to dissipate, their cries turning into faint whispers. But Lily wasn't gone. Her body lay still, but her eyes opened briefly, locking onto mine. I reported the incident, but the doctors chalked it up to stress and sleep deprivation. They moved Lily to another ward, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The room went completely dark. All I could hear was her voice, soft but chilling. "You're next." I'm still not sure how I got out of that room alive. But Lily, she's still there, waiting. And every night I wonder, did I make the right choice? Should I have ended her? Or did I just delay the inevitable? So, if you ever hear whispers in the dark, don't ignore them. Sometimes they're not just in your head. Sometimes they're warnings. And sometimes they're already too late.
One day you will wake up and feel invisible, like the people you've known for years suddenly don't even see you. That happened to me, only it wasn't just a feeling, it was my reality. And by the time I figured out why, it was too late. If you think you are safe, wait till you hear my story. I was just like you, an average person doing their job. My day started like any other shift. My name is Alicia. I am a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. I've worked here for years, and I know every corner of this place. Every creaky floorboard, every flickering light. That night, I arrived at 7 p.m., the same as always. But something was off right from the start. When I walked into the staff lounge, my co-workers were laughing over coffee. I greeted them, but they didn't even look up. I cleared my throat louder this time. Still nothing. It was as if I wasn't even there. Brushing it off as exhaustion or some weird prank, I grabbed my clipboard and started my rounds. But the unease only grew. My first stop was room 104, a regular checkup for Mrs. Bennett, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery. I knocked, opened the door, and gave her my usual reassuring smile. She screamed. Her frail hands clutched the bedsheets as she pressed herself against the headboard, her eyes wide with terror. "Mrs. Bennett, it's me, Alicia," I said, trying to calm her. But the more I spoke, the louder she screamed. The sound was piercing. It echoed down the hallway. Panicked, I backed out of the room and almost bumped into Dr. Grant, the attending physician. Relief flooded me. "Dr. Grant," I said, "something's wrong." He walked right past me as if I wasn't there. For the next hour, I tried to make sense of it. Every patient recoiled from me. The staff brushed past without so much as a glance. I checked my reflection in a bathroom mirror. Same dark hair, same tired eyes, same white uniform. I was still me, wasn't I? Desperate for answers, I went to the records room. If no one else was going to acknowledge me, I'd figure this out myself. I combed through patient logs, staff rosters, anything that could explain what was happening. That's when I stumbled on something that made my stomach drop. An old staff photo from decades ago. Nurses in crisp white uniforms standing in front of the hospital. I scanned the faces, and there I was, smiling back at me. Beneath the photo, a caption read, "Nurse Alicia Caldwell, 1957. I grabbed the file that matched the year. Inside were charred documents, singed around the edges. One stood out, a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Fire at St. Mary's claims 3 lives." My heart raced as I skimmed the article. The fire had started on July 14th. That was today's date. Among the names of the deceased was my own. I stumbled back, dropping the file. This couldn't be real. I wasn't dead, I was here, alive, breathing. But the more I thought about it, the more everything made sense. Patients' fear. The staff's indifference. I wasn't alive. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the pieces started falling into place. I wasn't just dead, I was trapped, reliving the last night of my life, over and over. But why? That's when I remembered something from the article. The fire had started in the basement. The report said it was caused by faulty wiring, but the details were vague. Had to know. The hospital basement was as cold and foreboding as I remembered. My footsteps echoed as I made my way through the labyrinth of storage rooms and old equipment. The air grew thicker, the smell of smoke faint but unmistakable. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure standing near the fuse box. It was me. I watched as my past self fiddled with the panel. Frustration etched across her face. I remembered this moment. The lights had been flickering all night, and I'd come down here to fix it. I didn't know I was sealing my fate. Suddenly, sparks flew from the box. My past self jumped back, knocking over a lantern. Flames erupted, spreading faster than I could react. The scene played out like a terrible déjà vu. But this time I wasn't just watching. I stepped forward, shouting at my past self to stop, to run. She didn't hear me. She couldn't. The flames roared, consuming everything in their path. I felt the heat, the suffocating smoke. But instead of fear, a strange calm washed over me. I knew what I had to do. As the fire raged, I turned toward the shadows creeping along the walls. Whispers filled the air. Regret, sorrow, pain. My own voice among them. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "For everything." The whispers grew louder, then softer like a sigh of relief. The flames began to waver, their light dimming, and then darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the staff lounge. The clock read 7 p.m., just like it had every night before. It's time again for the ward rounds, but this time something was different. The staff greeted me. The patients smiled. For the first time I felt seen. But if I am dead long ago, what is Mrs. Bennet still doing here? And why is she the first to see me? The clock ticked, and deep down I knew the loop wasn't over. Not yet. If you ever find yourself questioning what's real, take a closer look. Sometimes the truth is staring back at you through shadows, the reflection of a life you can't escape.
It was my first week working the night shift at St. Lucille's, and I thought I'd seen it all. But that's the thing about night shifts. You think you're just going through the motions, when really, you're walking straight into something you can't explain. Something you'll never forget. It started with whispers. People talking about a new doctor. A specialist, they said. But no one ever saw him during the day. Only at night. And his patients, well, they were always different after his visits. They called him the night doctor. It didn't take long before I noticed him myself. Tall, thin, always wearing the same white coat. His face a little too pale, his eyes too intense. At first, I thought it was just the exhaustion getting to me. But something about his presence gave me the chills. He didn't speak to anyone much. Just moved from one patient to the next with this eerie calmness, as if he was performing some sort of ritual. His treatments were always quick, his methods unconventional. But after his visits, the patients seemed, well, they seemed better, almost miraculously so. But here's the catch, they changed. They'd become eerily quiet, too quiet, subdued, almost robotic. Not a single complaint, not a single word, just blank glassy-eyed stares, like they were in a trance. I thought I was just being paranoid. I had a lot of long nights, but the more I saw, the more I started to wonder, what exactly was happening in those rooms? One night, curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow him. I wasn't sure why, but I needed answers. I'd seen him walk down the long corridor toward room 312. So I waited. I watched. The door clicked open, and I saw him disappear inside, the soft light from the hall casting long shadows across the floor. I waited for what felt like hours, but when he finally emerged, he looked different. There was something about him. His eyes were wider, more intense. His movements, more fluid, like a man who wasn't quite human. I quickly ducked out of sight and followed him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The patient from room 312, she was sitting up in bed, her face completely blank, her hands folded neatly on her lap. And she wasn't speaking. She wasn't even moving. That's when I realized I had to know what was going on. The next night, I found myself standing outside room 312, my heart racing. I pushed the door open just enough to peek inside. The doctor was there again, but this time, he wasn't just treating the patient. No, this time he was talking to her. He was speaking in low tones, so quietly I could barely hear. His words were calm, persuasive, like he was convincing her of something. "Do you want to live?" I heard him whisper. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I felt a strange tug in my chest. Something told me I shouldn't be here. Then the unthinkable happened. The doctor turned and looked directly at me. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, Everything else disappeared. The room, the hospital, the world. It was just him and me. Are you curious, Olivia? He asked, his voice smooth, almost hypnotic. I know who you are. But you should leave this place. It's not for you. I froze, heart pounding. How did he know my name? How did he know I was watching? I can help you, Olivia. I can save someone you love, he said, stepping closer. But there's a price. His voice was mesmerizing, almost soothing. But something in the back of my mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there. You see, he continued, I offer a deal, a chance at life, but at a cost. He smiled, a cold, chilling smile. A bargain. They give up their will, their desire, their soul, in exchange for survival. I felt the weight of his words sink in. It wasn't just about saving people. It was about controlling them, manipulating them. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't just dealing with a doctor. I was dealing with something far darker, something that shouldn't exist. I know you're wondering if I can save someone close to you, he said, almost reading my thoughts. You don't have to wonder, Olivia. I can. All you need to do is agree to my offer. I felt my blood run cold. Save someone you love, he repeated. But the price will be your soul. I wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, captivated by his words. My mind raced. My heart pounded in my chest. Could I do it? Could I really make this deal? He stepped closer, his presence suffocating. You can have anything, Olivia. Anything you want. All you need to do is surrender. Your soul for someone's life. I felt trapped. My morals screamed at me to reject him, to call for help, to expose him for what he really was. But my heart ached with the thought of the people I loved, people I could save. If only I accepted his offer. The choice was tearing me apart. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump, but not sure whether the fall would kill me or save me. You don't have to decide now, the doctor said, as if he could read my mind. But don't wait for too long. I could feel the weight of his words, heavy on my chest. And the truth, I didn't know if I could live with either choice. If I said no, would I be condemning someone I loved? If I said yes, would I lose my very soul? I could feel my hand shaking as I reached for the door. His voice echoed in my ears. Think about it carefully, Olivia. Think about what you value most. Your morals or your heart. The night doctor was gone, but the question he left behind, I don't have an answer. And the worst part, I think I'm running out of time. What would you choose?